Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 for Topic 12, and in this lecture we're going to be taking a look at criteria for winning an election. Alright, so what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, as I stated on the first slide, we're going to be looking at the criteria or the method used for determining who is the winner of the election. And so we're going to talk about plurality, majority, and proportional representation. All three are methods to determine who wins the election. And then we're going to take a look at how voters decide to cast their votes. Like, what are some of the factors that they take into consideration when they're deciding who to vote for? So that's what we're going to look at, and let's get started. There are different methods to determine election winners, and in fact you're going to be watching a couple of external videos, not ones that I've made, but from different sources that basically go into more detail than we're doing in lecture on the different criteria for winning elections. So there's a lot of different methods for figuring out who wins elections. And oftentimes the method that is used is a reflection of values. And when we're looking at the three main models that your textbook talks about, we're going to be taking a look at the benefits and the drawbacks. And if you think a model for winning elections, if you find benefits in it, then it's kind of a reflection of what your values are. If you find drawbacks, that's also a reflection of what your values are. And so depending on the method that you select, you might say, it's really important for ballots to be easy to understand, that it's easy to administer elections, it's easy to figure out who the winner is, and so you want to maybe select a method, the election method that reflects those values. You could say it's really important that what the majority wants gets reflected in who's elected, and so you might want a system that it revolves around majority rule. Make sure that the person who's elected actually has a majority of the vote. You could talk about fairness. In one of the videos that you're going to watch, it talks about Mars and that it's colonized, and where should the Mars sort of landing station be, and there are 4 different neighborhoods, right? Well, some methods for electing are not quite as fair as others. Do you value a diversity of viewpoints? Do you want more viewpoints in government, or do you just want 2 main party viewpoints? And so the method for determining who the winner of elections is oftentimes a reflection of what our values are. Now, as you'll see in the videos that you watch, no one method or criteria is the best. That there are benefits and drawbacks for all of the methods, and we're going to be exploring those in a few minutes. All right, so the first criteria for winning an election that we're going to talk about is the one that's the most predominant in the United States, which is the plurality system. The plurality system says that the winner is the candidate who earns the most votes, but not necessarily a majority of the votes. It's basically, it's oftentimes referred to as first past the poll or winner take all. So whoever gets the most votes, that's what's known as a plurality, then they win the congressional seat, or they win the governorship, or they win the presidency, or the member of parliament, whatever. And so it's whoever gets the most votes, they're the ones who become the winner. It's one of the most used election methods in the United States. So most of the elections that you'll be participating in are winner-take-all plurality elections. And so, for example, when the midterm elections come and you are voting for your congressional district, whichever candidate gets the most votes will win. Even when you vote for the president, even though it's ultimately you have to have a majority of the electoral votes to become president of the United States, to win the electoral votes in your state, like in Wisconsin, you just need to be the candidate that gets the most votes. And whoever gets the most votes in Wisconsin, who's running for president, they get all of the electoral votes for Wisconsin, all 10. So it's a good example of the plurality method. An example, here's just an abstract example, that candidate A gets 42% of the vote, candidate B gets 38% of the vote, candidate C gets 20% of the vote. If you're using the plurality method for determining who the winner is, who is the winner? Well, the winner is the one who got the most votes. They got 42% of the votes. And so candidate A, see, they're the winner, right? Because they got the most votes. So what are the benefits of using the plurality winner-takes-all system? Well, one of the benefits is it's a voting method that's simple and easy to use. The ballots are very easy. People just go in and they vote for the candidate that they want. They just put a check by the candidate's name. Then they submit their ballot. End of conversation. It's also easy to calculate the winner because you just count up all the votes and whoever gets the most votes win. And ease in calculating the winner can reduce the costs associated with administering elections. Elections are expensive to administer because you have to hire people to do all the vote tallying. And so there's an ease to it. It also promotes candidates and parties that have a wide appeal. Okay, so remember that from our last lecture, we were talking about that to get on the general ballot and to participate in the general election, you have to win a primary. Now, if you're a really extreme candidate from like the left or the right, and you win the primary, and then you get on the general election ballot, you've got to get the most votes, right, in the plurality system. And so oftentimes the candidate that gets the most votes has to appeal not just to a small sliver of a base of people, but have wider appeal. And so one of the benefits is that it promotes parties that reach not just a specific narrow segment of the population, but that a wider population. That's particularly true in a two-party system like we have in the United States, because usually it's like 2 or 3 parties that are running against each other, and so to win the plurality, you still have to win a pretty high percentage of the vote, even though it may not be a true majority. Some of the drawbacks that you can win an election without the majority of the votes. So from that example that we used on the previous slide, you'll note that candidates B and C, when you added up the votes that they received, they actually got 58% of the voters preferred a candidate other than the person who had the most votes, 42. And so that's a real drawback to the plurality. Also, that the plurality can lead to either voting for candidates other than those you think are going to win the majority. So it's kind of like a wasted vote, right? It's sort of like, hey, there's no way that my candidate's going to vote, so I win. But I'm going to vote for that candidate anyways because they are they're the candidate that best aligns with my values. And so in a plurality system, you're like, there's no way this person's going to get the most votes, but I'm going to vote for that person anymore. And that's kind of, I'm going to vote for that person anyways. So it's kind of a wasted vote. On the flip side of that you would vote for a candidate that you think will get the majority, right? It may not be your first choice, but you're like, well, I'm going to go with somebody who's actually going to get the most votes. And so you go for your second choice, okay? And so that can kind of be a drawback of the plurality system as well. Another criteria for winning an election is what's known as the majority system. And what the majority system is it says that the person who takes office must receive an absolute majority of all votes cast. Not just the most, that's the plurality system, but they actually have to have at least 50% of the voters plus one, right? One vote. That's what a pure majority is, right? That you act a majority, pure majority is where you get 50% plus one of the votes. And if no candidate gets 50% plus one of the votes that have been cast, there's oftentimes a runoff election, okay? And so the way that the runoff election works is it's like a second round. And most recently, if you recall, in 2020, there were 2 Georgia Senate races that were going on. And in the first round of voting, none of the candidates got a pure majority. And so they had 2 runoff elections, and so that so the 2 top vote getters went against each other, and there, when you only have 2 candidates, then one of the candidates is going to get a majority of the votes. And so a runoff election is a second round election between the top 2 candidates from the first round. So if in the first round of voting nobody gets up 50% plus 1, then you take the 2 top vote getters and then they run against each other. And since there's only 2 candidates, then one of the candidates is going to get 50% plus 1. Okay. In the videos, you're going to also talk. You're going to learn about this thing called an instant runoff ballot. And so, rather than actually having a second round election, you can have the ballot. And so it's like you rank the candidates. You vote for your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, and your fourth choice. And then if your first choice doesn't get a majority of the vote, then you go to the second choice, and then the second choice gets added into the remaining candidates, and then so on and so forth. You keep going down on the instant runoff ballot until somebody gets 50%. Now, I didn't explain that very well, but in the video, you'll see a better explanation of the instant runoff ballot. And the benefit of that is that you have one election, but you use a ballot that actually kind of serves as a second runoff election where you can determine which candidate actually got 50% plus one of the votes cast. So what are the benefits of the majority system? Well, one of the benefits is that it ensures that the winner actually has majority support, right? So in the plurality system, the person who takes office could have 40% of the vote. Heck, they could have 20% of the vote if there's lots of people running for that office. In the majority system, the person who wins gets the seat, who wins the election. Actually, the majority of the voters want that person. It also reduces wasted votes because voters get a second chance. And so in the first election, you vote for your favorite candidate. And if your candidate doesn't win, and then you take the two top vote getters, and then you have a second election, a runoff election, so you get to vote again. So in the first election, you can actually go with the candidate that you really want, see if they get the majority. If they don't get a majority, you get a second chance. It can also build coalitions in the runoff elections. So since you have two candidates, the two top vote getters who go against each other in the runoff election, those candidates know that they didn't win the majority of the vote in the first election. And so they got to reach out to other voters and say, hey, I know you didn't vote for me the first time, but this is why you should vote for me in this runoff election. And so it kind of builds unity and coalition with voters. And the candidates have to like lure voters in to say, look, I know you didn't pick me the first time, but let me tell you why you should go with me in the second round. Some of the drawbacks are it's costly. Okay, super costly to have two elections. It's not only costly for the state because they have to run two elections, but it's costly for the candidates as well. And if you don't use a runoff election, like where you have one election and then you have another election if there's no majority winners, and you use the instant runoff ballots, as you're going to see in that video, it can be kind of confusing to voters because it's like there's 5 people running and you've got to rank those people, and then figuring out who actually won that election can also be time consuming and costly. All right, let's take a look at proportional representation and how that works as a criteria for winning an election. In proportional representation, the way that it works is that you base the vote on the political party you want rather than the actual candidate that you want. Although you are kind of voting for candidates because each party will put forward a slate of candidates. And so in proportional representation, political parties win legislative seats in proportion to the support that the public has for that particular political party. The proportional representation gives a voice to smaller parties in government. We're going to see that that's maybe one of the benefits of proportional representation. So let's use a hypothetical example so we'd see how that it would play out if we used proportional representation in the state of Wisconsin. Now, one method of proportional representation is known as the party list method. And what that basically means is that each party in the state of Wisconsin would draw up a list of candidates for the upcoming election. And so imagine that Wisconsin had 10 seats in the House of Representatives. We do not have 10 seats in the House of Representatives right now. We have 8. But I'm just using 10 seats because it makes it easier to do the math, as you'll see in a minute. And so rather than having it how we have it today, where it's like if you live in District 1, that you have candidates who run in District 1, and whoever wins District 1 with the most votes represents District 1 in the House of Representatives. We basically say that Wisconsin has 10 total seats, and let's divide them up proportionally according to the support that Wisconsin has for the different political parties. And so the Republicans would say, here are our 10 candidates. If we win 100% of the vote, then these are the 10 candidates we would send to Congress. The Democrats would have 10 candidates listed. The Green Party, the Libertarian Party, whatever party wanted to run. And then we would vote. And we would vote for, you'd go in and you'd say, I want the Republican Party. And then if you go in and you say, I want the Democratic Party, each voter would cast their vote for the party that they wanted to be aligned with, not the specific candidates, but the party. And then you'd look at the outcome. And so you say, okay, in Wisconsin, on the day of the election, 40% of Wisconsin voters voted for the Republican Party, 30 voted for the Democratic Party, 20 20% voted for the Libertarian Party, and 10% of Wisconsinites voted for the Green Party. And then, that's why I use 10 because it makes life easier, then we would divide up the seats proportionally. Since the Republicans got 40% of the Wisconsin vote, they would get 4 seats, the Democrats would get 3, the Libertarians would get 2, and the Green Party would get 1. That's how proportional representation works in terms of determining who wins the election. Okay, so what are the benefits and drawbacks for proportional representation? Well, one of the benefits is that it translates votes into seats won, right? And so the method that we use now, plurality, winner take all, people vote for candidates that for parties that just never win the seat. And so with proportional representation, what the voters want gets cast in the seats that represent Wisconsin. It also gives voice to third parties, so that you might vote for, if you were a third party, like if you didn't really align really properly with the Democrats or Republicans, you might identify with the Libertarians or the Green Party, but you might not ever vote for them because you feel like it's a wasted vote. Well, in proportional representation, usually it's as long as one party gets like 10% of the vote, they can win a seat. So you might be more inclined to vote for a third party. And in fact, your vote wouldn't be wasted as long as it reaches the certain threshold of 10%. And also because you're dividing up seats not by congressional district, but by like the whole state, the representatives are really running to represent the interests of the state of Wisconsin, not just their congressional district. Now, I'm putting that as a benefit, but you could see that as a drawback as well, because maybe it's important that you have district representatives, like representatives who are representing, the district that is urban, like Milwaukee, versus a rural area. The interests are different. But this way we'd make sure that the candidates really care about all aspects of the state, and it might provide more unity for the state or the country. Obviously, there are some drawbacks if no one party has the majority in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, then you have to form a coalition government to get anything done, right? And so let's say that the House of Representatives was 40% Republicans, 30% Dems, 20% Libertarians, 10% Greens. You still have to have a majority of representatives to pass laws. Well, so the Republican Party would have to align with a party within Congress to get stuff done, and that could be good because it could build compromise, but it could also lead to a really unstable, government where it's, that maybe you have a coalition and it falls apart. And so there's some instability there. Also, it has the potential to give a voice to extremists. So if all you have to do is win 10% of the vote and you get a seat, well, just imagine sort of the extreme parties that could run. And that I would view as a drawback, although at least if an extreme party wins, you can hear how extreme their viewpoints are. And if their extreme viewpoints are something that's good for the public good, they might be able to become less of like a minority party. But if that extremist viewpoint is really like negative, then they get a platform to actually voice their point of view within the national legislature, and you could sort of see that as a drawback. So before we move on to what people take in mind when casting their vote, I just want to think critically a little bit about the criteria for winning an election. We've gone through the benefits and the drawbacks of the different methods, okay? But, in the United States, as you know, most races are won by a plurality. You just need to get the most votes in order to take the seat. So what do you think? Do you think we should stick with that criteria or change it? Would you like to see more majority, having more runoff elections, or using an instant runoff ballot so that the person who wins that seat is actually winning the majority of the vote? Would you like to see proportional representation in the United States? So just some things to consider, particularly as we move to the final exam. There will be some questions on it that will give you an opportunity to think more deeply about that. Okay, so now let's talk about how voters decide. Okay, we've talked about the methods used for determining winners, but when you actually go into the voting booth and decide that you're going to vote for a particular candidate, what do voters take into consideration? Well, maybe use yourself as an example. I know some of you in this class did vote in the 2020 election. And so when you cast your vote for the president in the 2020 election, what factors helped you decide? Like, what did you think about? Were you voting for your party? You were like, I didn't really care who the candidate was, but I'm going to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans or the Greens or whatever. Did you base your vote not on party, but like policies that you were interested in? Did you vote on just certain characteristics of the candidate, or were there characteristics of the candidates that you were like, I don't like those characteristics, I'm voting for the other person? And if you didn't vote in 2020, what will help you decide? So like as we come closer to the midterm elections and the next presidential election, what are some factors that you would take into consideration when you're casting your vote? Well, your textbook talks about different elements that people take into consideration. One is partisanship. And so, people are loyal to their party. And at the end of the day, a lot of people vote for the candidate that aligns with their party. And so if you're a Republican, you vote for the Republican. If you're a Democrat, you vote for the Democrat. A lot of voters say that they don't use partisanship when determining who they're going to vote for. There's not a lot of opportunities, or there are not a lot of evidence that people cross party lines a lot, particularly for the president and for the Senate and the House. Not that it doesn't happen, but usually if people say they're Republican or they lean Republican, they vote Republican. Democrat, lean Democrat, they vote Democrat. So partisanship is something that helps voters decide. Issues and policy concerns. That are there policies that you really care about, like really care about the environment, really care about the free market and wanting to reduce regulations on corporations? Like what are your key issues? Do you use those to drive your voting? Your textbook talks about two kind of issues and policy concerns, the way it plays out with voting. They talk about prospective voting, that you listen to what the candidate says they're going to do in terms of policy, and then you hope that the candidate will do that. You're like, oh man, I really, like these ideas that the candidate has. I'm not sure that they haven't run for office before, or when they did, they didn't enact those, but they say they're going to enact them, and I think that they will. So I'm looking prospectively forward. I'm looking to the future, and I feel confident that this candidate is going to do what they say they're going to do. Or are you a retrospective voter, where you vote on what the candidate has already done? You're like, man, they have a really good track record. The policies that they support are policies that I support, and I figure they're going to continue on that same line. Another thing that your textbook talks about is the economy. So sometimes the economy is just out of the hands of like the people in office, right? There's not a lot that, that the current president can do to affect the economy. So for example, when the economy collapsed in 2008, and George Bush was the president at that time, he wasn't responsible for the economic collapse that was based on the banking practices. Same with the economic collapses associated with the pandemic. How you handle the pandemic is one thing, but there was going to be an economic collapse associated with the pandemic regardless. And so, a lot of times it's out of the elected officials' control. However, that being the case, that we still take it into consideration when we're casting our vote. If we're satisfied with economic conditions, if we think the economy is moving in the right direction, we tend to support the party that's in power, right? So if Biden, if he runs for re-election in 2024, which he most likely will, I guess it remains to be seen, if the economy is gangbusters and it's really recovered from the pandemic and, unemployment's really low and everybody's like making more money, dream on, right? Then it, not related to Biden, but just like everybody always wants to be making more money, right? Then you might be like, I'm going to vote for Biden, because he's doing a good job with the economy. If you feel like the economy's in the tank, you're going to blame Biden for it, whether he's responsible for it or not, and you're not likely to vote for him. It's going to be tougher for him to win re-election. If you're unsatisfied with the way the economy is going, you're oftentimes going to support the opposition. So the economy, while elected officials might not have a huge control over economic factors, some, but not not as significant as we like to think, it doesn't matter because we blame those in office for economic conditions, or we reward those in office for vibrant and healthy economic conditions. And then finally, there are just candidate characteristics that we take into consideration, whether we like to admit it or not. Political science has done some, research on taking a look at just you show people pictures of candidates and you don't tell them what party they are aligned with or what their policies are, but you just show them pictures of candidates. And then you have people say, would you vote for this person or not? And there's certain characteristics that people like. For example, they like candidates that have long, narrow faces as opposed to round, fatter faces. Voters will just be like, I'm going for the candidate that has the narrow face, right? Not the round face, because it's sort of like we maybe attribute certain positive characteristics to the thin, narrow face and negative characteristics to the round face. And so candidates are really aware of that, of some of the frivolous considerations that voters take into consideration, like the way they look. A classic example is Al Gore. When he was running for re-election, he had a bald spot on the back of his head, and like a lot of men of his age did, no harm in that, right? But he didn't let, I'm not making this up, he did not let the media take pictures from behind because he didn't want his bald spot to show, because he was really thought it would affect his chances at getting elected for president. And Al Gore's just one example in terms of crafting an appearance that candidates consider because voters take it into consideration. There's other candidate characteristics, their experience, that are less frivolous and more important. Their experience, their knowledge, do they seem knowledgeable? Do they seem like they know what they're talking about? And do they come off as trustworthy? That's maybe a little bit harder to measure, but that some candidates might, if they make a mistake, they might own up to it, they take personal responsibility for it, and that might come off as being more of a trustworthy candidate. But those are just some of the other candidate characteristics that voters take into consideration, and you can ask yourself, to what degree do you take those into consideration? All right, so in conclusion, hopefully the information about elections will give you more confidence about participating in upcoming elections. I know people really like to vote in elections. It's the main way that we politically participate, but sometimes it's easy to get confused because we have so many elections in the United States. So hopefully this information will allow you to participate in elections with more confidence. It also, the more you learn about elections, the more you might want to advocate for electoral reform, right? If you think that you would like to see proportional representation or ranked balloting, where you rank the candidates, have instant runoff election ballots, you might want to support candidates who would get in the state legislature and make those kinds of changes. Because states can make those kinds of changes in terms of how we elect people to the House of Representatives, and also elect our president with the Electoral College, although we'd have to change the Constitution for that. And as always, keep in mind that an informed and active populace is a key feature of maintaining a democratic society. So the more informed you are, then the more active you're likely to be, and you'll be a positive contributor to the democratic society. All right, thanks a lot for listening. Talk to you again soon.